Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. Chapter 2. Dialectics. This new German philosophy culminated in the Hegelian system. In this system, and herein is its great merit, for the first time the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a praxis. It est as in constant motion, change, transformation, development, and the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development. From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild whirl of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man itself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process, to roll its devious ways, and to trace out the inner law running through all its apparently accidental phenomenon. That the Hegelian system did not solve the problem it propounded is here immaterial. Its epoch-making merit was that it propounded the problem. This problem is one that no single individual will ever be able to solve. Although Hegel was, with Saint-Simon, the most encyclopedic mind of his time, yet he was limited first by the necessary limited extent of his own knowledge, and second by the limited extent and depth of the knowledge and conceptions of his age. To these limits a third must be added. Hegel was an idealist. To him the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things in their evolution were only the realized pictures of the idea, existing somewhere from eternity before the world was. This way of thinking turned everything upside down, and completely reversed the actual connection of things in the world. Correctly and ingeniously as many groups of facts were grasped by Hegel, yet, for the reasons just given, there is much that is botched, artificial, labored, in a word, wrong, in point of detail. The Hegelian system in itself was a colossal miscarriage, but it was also the last of its kind. It was suffering, in fact, from an internal and incurable contradiction. Upon the one hand, its essential proposition was the conception that human history is a process of evolution which, by its very nature, cannot find its intellectual final term in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth. But, on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. A system of natural and historical knowledge embracing everything and final for all time is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectic reasoning. This law, indeed, by no means excludes, but on the contrary, includes the idea that the systematic knowledge of the external universe can make giant strides from age to age. The perception of the fundamental contradiction in German idealism led necessarily back to materialism, but, nota bene, not to simply metaphysical, exclusively mechanical materialism of the 18th century. Old materialism looked upon all previous history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence. Modern materialism sees in it the process of evolution of humanity, and aims at discovering the laws thereof. With the French of the 18th century, and even with Hegel, the conception obtained of nature as a whole, moving in narrow circles, forever immutable, with its eternal celestial bodies, as Newton, an unalterable organic species, as Linnaeus taught. Modern materialism embraces the more recent discoveries of natural science, according to which nature also has its history in time. The celestial bodies, like the organic species that, under favorable conditions, people them, being born and perishing. And even if nature, as a whole, must still be said to move in recurrent cycles, these cycles assume infinitely larger dimensions. In both aspects, modern materialism is essentially dialectic, and no longer requires the assistance of that sort of philosophy which, queen-like, pretended to rule the remaining mob of sciences. And as soon as each special science is bound to make clear in position in the great totality of things and of our knowledge of things, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous and unnecessary. That which still survives of all earlier philosophy is the science of thought and its law, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is subsumed in the positive science of nature and history. Whilst, however, the revolution and the conception of nature could only be made in proportion to the corresponding positive materials furnished by research, already much earlier certain historical facts had occurred which led to a decisive change in the conception of history. In 1831, the first working class rising took place in Lyons. Between 1838 Anno Domini and 1842 Anno Domini, the first national working class movement, that of the English Chartists, reached its height. The class struggle between proletarian and bourgeoisie came to the front in the history of the most advanced countries in Europe, in proportion to the development, upon the one hand, of modern industry, upon the other, of the newly acquired political supremacy of the bourgeoisie. Facts more and more strenuously gave the lie to the teachings of bourgeois economy as to the identity of the interests of capital and labor, as to the universal harmony and universal prosperity that would be the consequence of unbridled competition. All these things could no longer be ignored, any more than the French and English socialism, which was their theoretical, though very imperfect, expression. But the old idealist conception of history, which was not yet dislodged, knew nothing of class struggles based upon economic interests, knew nothing of economic interests. Production and all economic relations appeared in it only as incidental, subordinate elements in the history of civilization. The new facts made imperative a new examination of all past history. Then it was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles. That these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and of exchange, in a word, of the economic conditions of their time. That the economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis, starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institutions, as well as of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period. Hegel has freed history from metaphysics. He made it dialectic, but his conceptions of history was essentially idealistic. But now, idealism was driven from its last refuge, the philosophy of history. Now a materialistic treatment of history was propounded, and a method found of explaining man's knowing by his being, instead of, as heretofore, his being by his knowing. From that time forward, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Its tasks were no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historical, economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. But the socialism of earlier days was incompatible with this materialist conception, as the conception of nature of the French materialists was with dialectics and modern natural science. The socialism of earlier days certainly criticized the existing capitalistic mode of production and its consequences, but it could not explain them, and therefore could not get mastery of them. It could only simply reject them as bad. The more strongly this earlier socialism denounced the exploitations of the working class inevitable under capitalism, the less able was it clearly to show in what this exploitation consisted and how it arose. But for this it was necessary to present the capitalistic mode of production in its historical connection and its inevitableness during a particular historical period, and therefore also to present its inevitable downfall, and to lay bare its essential character, which was still a secret. This was done by the discovery of surplus value. It was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of the capitalistic mode of production, and of the exploitation of the worker that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of his laborer at its full value as a commodity on the market, he yet extracts more value from it than he paid for, and that, in the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms those sums of value from which are heaped up constantly increasing masses of capital in the hands of the possessing classes. The genesis of capitalist production and the production of capital were both explained. These two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. The next thing was to work out all its details and relations.